Laura Benjamin is joining us from her office today. So she's going to monitor everyone that's on Zoom. For those of you on Zoom, please remain muted until a time when you might want to pose a question. There will be times during the presentation where we'll ask for questions. For those of you on Zoom, you can type them in the Zoom chat, which Laura's monitoring, or you can unmute yourself to ask the question. We'll recognize those in the room for questions live. We're recording today's class, and we'll be making a recording available on RVAR's YouTube channel for at least 90 days period. For those of you that are in class today, there may be a survey, or there will be a survey after class. We'd appreciate it if you would take that. Before we get started, I just want to mention the next two RVAR events that are coming up. RVAR is going to hold its annual Realtor Affiliate Night on Tuesday, April 15th from 5 to 8 p.m. at Roanoke Country Club. There's going to be food, prizes, networking, vendors, and realtors. So there's still time to register. Please do that. Also, the next class that we're going to have is Aging in Place. That's going to be offered on Tuesday, April 22nd at 11 a.m. at RVAR office here. And now for today's class. So let me introduce you to Dr. Marcus Aguillar. He is with Roanoke City's Stormwater Division.
All right, let me do a quick sound check. So I'm going to mute that. Let's see. Laura, I can see you on Zoom. Can you give me a thumbs up that the audio is coming through okay? Okay, sweet. I think technology is good. Thank you for the introduction, Lisa. My name is Marcus Aguillar. I'm a senior engineer at the City of Roanoke Stormwater Utility. We are a division inside of the Public Works Department at the city government. We have counterparts in the city engineer's office, transportation group, environmental management. I'm forgetting. No, I think that's all. So we work on infrastructure in the city, right? In the Department of Public Works. It's a pleasure to come talk to you all this morning. I'm an engineer by training. I teach engineering on Monday nights at Virginia Tech. Most of the talks that I give are like technical and sciencey and kind of antiseptic, and so it's like fun to like have an opportunity to talk to a different audience today. I feel very comfortable answering questions along the way. So if you guys have a question, or if there's one from the Zoom audience, please feel free to go ahead and relay that through, and I'll be just repeating it back so everybody can hear. We'll also do Q&A at the end, just so that folks can, get anything cleared up if they need to. It's 11:06, so I'm going to try to be done by a little bit before noon, and then we'll do 15 to 20 minutes for questions at the end, just so everybody kind of knows what they're getting into this morning. Okay, so let's get started. Before I get into like the content for today, let me just share with you guys. So I'm not originally from Roanoke. I grew up in Houston, and I love living here. I love being a Roanoker now. My wife and I love the mountains. We moved to Southwest Virginia a little bit over 10 years ago. We lived in Blacksburg for a number of years. And actually, Amber Mason helped us buy our first home here in Roanoke and Cave Spring. And it's been a wonderful move for our family. We have two little girls, a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. Which is why I'm used to answering like all manner of strange questions. So, feel free to ask whatever. And also being interrupted is very common for me. So feel free to jump in whenever. Today, we're going to talk about stormwater management. We're going to talk about floodplains and regulations. But one of the common threads that I just want to share with you guys is just that our team is working on sort of a healthy interaction between our community and the landscape that we live in. Okay, we have this really beautiful valley. We've got mountains, rivers, and it's our prerogative as Roanoke City Stormwater to make sure that those streams and their watersheds are clean, enjoyable places for us to live in and to use and to interact with. You all as realtors are working on the interaction between humans and their landscapes as well in a different way, no doubt. but that is some common ground that I think we are going to share with you guys. So if you have questions about that, please feel free to dig in later. The agenda for this morning, first, I'm going to give you guys like a flyover of sort of like the history of water resources in the Roanoke Valley. I think that'll be really fun. Not the major thrust of the presentation, but just a little bit of background. Then I'm going to share with you about our team, the stormwater team, some of the work that we do that you all may be able to engage with or jump in some fashion. Mckenzie is going to get up and talk about floodplain maps and relevant programs that go with that. So I'm buying a home in or near a floodplain. I want to have some information on that. So those sorts of that sort of information. And then we'll finish with Q&A at the end. I forgot to introduce Mckenzie a little bit further. She's our water quality administrator. She'll get up and talk about halfway through the presentation and answer questions about floodplain related issues, but she also knows a ton about river water quality and stream water quality in the valley. So fair game as well. Okay, let's talk about water resources history here in Roanoke for just a couple of minutes. The idea that I want you guys to gain from this is that the history of development, the history of people living here in Roanoke Valley is really a function of the geography and the hydrology. So the streams and the waterways that go through the valley. And in a lot of ways that hasn't changed, right? A lot of ways our geography and our hydrology circumscribes our communities. We'll talk about that in just a minute when I show you guys this next slide. Okay, so the first thing is, let's talk really quick about watersheds, okay? A watershed is an area of land that drains to a point on the map. So what I'm showing on my screen here is the upper Roanoke River watershed outlined in red, okay? It's a 584 square mile area. It starts up in, you can see, is my pointer gonna work? Yeah, you can see Blacksburg, Montgomery County, Christiansburg is up here. So here's the Interstate 81 corridor. So as you're driving down from Christiansburg, for example, you'll notice that you're slowly doing this, right? You're slowly making your way down. And that's what the watershed in general is doing. There's mountains up at the top. So North Mountain is right here. It's this ridge as you're along Interstate 81, looking off to your left. Well, you should be focusing on Interstate 81, right? Don't be looking around if you're the passenger, okay? So you look off to your left, that's North Mountain. And then if you look off to your right, that's going to be Poor Mountain off on the right-hand side. And the streams, the North Fork of the Roanoke River, starts really up by Blacksburg, Montgomery County. It swings all the way around that mountain. Paris Mountain, I think, is the one right here. And it comes back and it meets the South Fork of the river near the Roanoke exit off of Interstate 81. The river, the main stem of the river then flows on down, generally along the 81 US 11 corridor through Salem. Oops, cursor is going wild. Salem, and then on into Roanoke City. The important things to see in this figure, there's a couple things. So the first is, you can see the topography. You can see the topography in my map, right? It's kind of shaded. It's really, really like wrinkly and folded, right? There's mountains all around us. And that's important. We love living here because we have this beautiful scenic view of all these mountains around us. But from a flooding standpoint, it means that the developed lands, city of Salem and Roanoke, is at the bottom of the proverbial bathtub. It means all of that water that falls on the landscape above us moves pretty quickly off of those mountains into the streams, and it flows into the river and then on through Roanoke. Most of the development in Salem and in Roanoke is in the flat lands, right? It's easier to build homes and businesses where it's not so mountainous, which also happens to be the floodplain of the Roanoke River and its tributaries, okay? Back in the late 1700s and 1800s, there wasn't much here, right? It was a very small, it was Big Lick. There was a couple of small ad hoc settlements here in the area. The river and the floodplains were, they were intrinsic to survival, right? The river provided fertile land along the floodplains for the growth of cotton and tobacco and agriculture. The river provided both sanitation and drinking water supply. It was also at that time, you all remember that most commerce happened on America's rivers on the eastern seaboard, right? So the James River was a huge commercial asset in the development of the US. The Roanoke River was less so, right? It's a smaller river, and once you get this high up in the watershed, have you all canoed the river? Has anybody done that, or kayaked or anything like that? Okay, a couple folks have done it. If you do it like on a low flow day, it's not that fun, right? Like you're scraping bottom so think about if you had like a 50-foot long bateau with a load of timber on it. It's gonna be hard, right? So it wasn't as easy to get materials in and out of the watershed as it was like along the James River system. But important nonetheless. And around 1800, there was this important commercial switch that happened here in the Roanoke Valley. What was that? Does anybody know? The railroad, right? The railroad landed. So whereas before it was very difficult to move commerce in and out of our river basin, the railroad opened up this pathway for the movement of goods like, all the agricultural commodities out into the eastern seaboard and then north and south. The important thing to understand there is that the railroads, because of the nature, what you're trying to do, they're looking for the flattest slopes, right? And the flattest slopes through the valley are along the river corridors. So a lot of the railroads that came through here, part of that decision was we have this very flat, and I'm gonna actually zoom in on Roanoke City here for a moment. We have this very flat area. Zoom, good. Right here around the confluence of these smaller tributaries. So Lick Run runs along Interstate 581, and Trout Run is actually the stream that flows through downtown Roanoke. And then it's actually connected with the floodplain of the river. So it's super flat. The railroad men of the time, they said, this is a great place for an intersection, right? Let's put it here, the north-south line and the east-west line. And really the rest is history, right? We know that Roanoke developed very rapidly after that happened. And some of the literature calls it even kind of a hasty, chaotic, like it just happened so fast that it is almost more akin to like a Western gold rush town, right? So quickly that the valley grew from its humble beginnings into this really industrial superpower of the 1850s and so forth. So, okay, so a little bit of geography and economy background for you. I zoomed in. Let's see if I can get back. Okay, so I zoomed in on the city of Roanoke there. Okay, so that's the service area that our team operates in. So it's about 43 square miles. And as I mentioned, it's at this sort of convergence of all these different waterways, right? And this is why flooding is so important to us. So if I zoom back in again on the city itself, I'm gonna just narrate some of the streams just so you all can orient yourself. So the Roanoke River flows east to west, more or less across the center of the city. It kind of bisects the city. We have about 10 miles of Roanoke River in the city, okay? We have 13 smaller tributaries that I have shown on the map. They're named tributaries. Let's see, we're down in here somewhere, right? Not exactly sure. Yeah, somewhere in here. Part of the drainage from here is going to flow off into Murray Run, which flows through Fishburne Park. It's that really cute little stream that flows through the park. Yes, you have a question? Yeah.
Flows behind my house. I have flood insurance.
Great, that's good. Yeah, we'll talk about that. Yeah, boom. Yeah, great little creek. And Murray Run is one of these streams, right? Like the rest of them that under normal, like if we went out to a Fishburne Park today, it would be wonderful, right? Like the creeks they're cute, there's rocks in them. My kids get down and play in them and build little dams and stuff and play with the bugs in the creek. But when it floods, these things turn into monsters, right? And that is a function of, we have these mountains around us, we have a lot of developed land around us. So the impervious cover generates a lot of runoff. Murray Run, Mudlick Creek is the one next to it over. Mudlick Creek runs along Garce Mill Road, Grandin Road, kind of as you're going into Grandin. You guys have probably seen that one at flood stage too. It's pretty scary. All of them operate that way, right? Flooding is a nonlinear process, which means that it's like when it's not flooding, people laugh when I say this is such a, anyway, when it's not flooding, right? It's fine. But when it's flooding, it's flooding. It's like, come on, Marcus, that's a ridiculous way of saying that. But you guys know what I mean, right? You've seen when it's flooding, it's scary, right? So the thing I'm getting at here is that when people think of flooding in Roanoke, they think a lot about the Roanoke River, which is important, no doubt. But there's all these smaller waterways throughout the city that are mostly hidden. They're mostly hidden during dry day conditions, but when it floods, it's important to understand that the universe of flooding issues that our team has to deal with is bigger than just the Roanoke River. It's the Roanoke River plus the smaller tributaries. We also have a very extensive storm drain system, which I'll get to in a second. That's also part of our, the universe of what the stormwater management team is involved. Okay. Any questions so far? See any from the Zoom room? I think we're good. Okay. Very good. Let me show you guys some photos of what I mean by those different flooding processes. Okay, so this is the one that, this is the type of flood that Roanokers probably have in their minds, especially those of you that have been around for a long time. Is anybody here during the Great Flood of 1985? Okay, so we have some memory. So Mckenzie and her team have this really cool, is it the 40th anniversary? They're like trying to gather the stories. Because history gets lost, right? Unless you capture it. So if you all are interested, reach out to her. Everybody has a crazy story that went through, right? It was nuts, right? Everyone I've ever talked to has some memory of like, I got stuck in this building, I was there overnight, whatever, right? So please feel free to share this if you'd like. This is a photograph of Wasena Park. I think I actually took this from the old Main Street Bridge when it was not being rebuilt. It's facing, this would be upstream towards like Vic Thomas Park. There's a pedestrian bridge that goes across, baseball fields, tennis courts, very nice looking. We go there all the time. Under flood stage, this is what it looks like, right? During the flood of 85. So the Roanoke River becomes this enormous monster and takes the whole flood corridor with it. The FEMA floodplain maps that Mackenzie's going to talk about in a couple minutes are focused really on this type of flooding. All right. So they portray flood risk for you all, for our community, for watersheds that are generally larger than about a square mile. Okay. If the watershed that's causing the flooding is smaller than that, the FEMA maps are not going to capture that. Okay. And the point there is not trying to like freak anybody out, but it's important to understand that like flood risk can exist beyond what FEMA tells us. And in Roanoke, because we have such flat land, we have such active smaller waterways, that can actually be a meaningful component of flooding here in the Roanoke Valley. We call that type of flooding pluvial flooding. Okay, so it's not associated with a river. Pluvial is like rainfall, right? It's a rainfall intensity driven process. And you all have experienced this, right? You're driving around, it's fine, it's the spring. All of a sudden you see the thunderstorm roll in, the sky opens up and it rains for 25 minutes, 35 minutes, cats and dogs, right? Your windshield wipers are going as fast as you can, you're pulling off the side of the road, and then it stops and it's over, right? And it happens in some parts of the city, and then you talk to your neighbor the next day and you're like, wow, how about that rain yesterday? And they're like, what are you talking about? It didn't rain over here, right? And so it's very common, right? We have a landscape because of the mountains around us again, that they're pushing air up into the atmosphere and they're forcing these small bursts of convective thunderstorms that they just open up in certain areas. So here's a photograph of the intersection of First and Salem in downtown Roanoke. Under dry day conditions, obviously it's just a happy little road. And then this is during one of those brief, just downpours. The streets go under, it floods for 25 minutes, the water goes away. It's not a loss of life situation, right? It's my business is shut down, I'm having to clean stuff up, my car got flooded. Not good though, right? We don't want this for downtown Roanoke. This is not a sustainable thing. Our team is working on a long-range strategy for addressing this. Part of the problem here is that downtown sits atop a salt marsh, right? So there's actually a marsh underneath the central business district. It was buried around 1900. There's a stream that flows underneath Campbell Avenue. It is yucky. Do not go down there. In case you were thinking about it. The stream is called Trout Run. And in addition to there being a salt marsh, the land above downtown is also, it's about 67% impervious cover. So there's a lot of pavement that is causing that water to just go directly into town. And also we get these brief intense bursts of rainfall, right? So it's sort of this perfect storm of circumstances. So this is pluvial flooding, right? There is sort of technically a stream down there, but this kind of flash flooding that's related to very small streams and storm drains is another piece of the flooding picture here in Roanoke. And this is not unique to Roanoke. It's anywhere that you have an older city that has a lot of impervious cover that was developed in the 1800s. You know, there wasn't engineering standards. There wasn't a ton of long range planning at the front end of these cities. And so now we have this arrangement that is not conducive to a happy cooperation between humans and landscape. Okay. Not unique to Roanoke by any means, just a part of the bigger picture. There's some literature that actually says that pluvial flooding is the more costly component of flooding in the US, as in like FEMA has captured maybe less than 50% of the actual flood impacts, which is crazy. But I think after having been in the field for about 15 years, and especially living in Houston, I think I might be starting to believe that statistic. So, all right, so that's pluvial flooding. And then the last thing I want to just mention that our team is engaged in is water quality. Okay, and this is, you know, it shouldn't really be separated from the hydrology and flooding piece. Here in the city, or rather, as the city, we have a permit. We have a permit to discharge stormwater into perennial streams. Okay, the permit is it's from EPA through DEQ. The city holds this thing. We have to do all kinds of different activities to make sure that we're in compliance with permit. Mckenzie's kind of leads that effort for us. The reason we have to do this is because our streams over the course of time have been designated by the state as impaired. Okay? Impaired means that there are a number of different water quality issues that they're not achieving state standards for clean water. Okay? It doesn't mean that you're going to jump in and like immediately get sick. Doesn't mean that there's a necessarily like a risk of like, oh, I go dip my toe in the water, I'm going to have some horrible disease. It means that there's a standard in the state law that the streams have to achieve, and that at one time or another the streams did not achieve. Make sense? So our job as the stormwater team is over time, over decadal time frames, to try to work our way back to a state that all of our waterways are achieving all of those standards. Okay. Might sound initially scary, but let me just give you some context. There was a engineering study that was like I think it was a 1945 study from Virginia Tech, where they looked at the Roanoke River and they did was sort of like a chemical and biological assessment of the river. Okay, from Salem, I think, all the way down to like close to the Niagara Dam. The findings of the study was that the river at that time was essentially an abiotic system. It had died, right? Like it was in really bad shape. And that was a function of like just municipal discharge of municipal wastewater, discharge of industrial wastewater. There was like flotillas of algae over the top of the thing. It was unusable, right? It was so bad that there's like these stories of, I think it was down at the Visco's plant, they had a raw water intake that they were using for processes or whatever. And the water was in such bad shape that it was destroying the mechanical components that the water was touching, right? So that's 1945, that's a long time ago. We're not there anymore, right? The river is nowhere close to that state, okay? It is in much better shape than that, right? When I go in my 16-foot Mad River canoe with my little kids, I'm not worried about like flotillas of algae. I'm not worried about if one of them falls in, it's like, get out, like don't drown, right? But like, the water quality is like, it's not that alarming. So yes, we do have these water quality impairments, right? That the state has designated. Yes, our team is working on them. No, the river is no longer an abiotic system, right? It's in much better shape than it used to be. And so are the tributaries, right? in any case, the three things that we're working on are, one of them has to do with the little bugs that live on the stream bottom. Benthic macroinvertebrates. Okay, they're these crazy looking little critters that if you dig around enough on the stream bottom, they're just bugs basically, but they're really cool looking. Little kids love them. When there's not enough of them and they're not diverse enough, that means that the ecosystem is impaired in some fashion. And because they're essentially the base of the food chain, when they're impaired, everything above them is also impaired. Does that make sense? And so our prerogative is, if you can fix the bugs, then the other things come with it. And we have these cool science and engineering programs to try to fix the bugs. Fix the bugs, right? Okay, so there's aquatic insects. We have a bacteria impairment. That one is, again, it's achieving water quality standards problem. It's not like I'm going to get into the stream and immediately be sick. Mckenzie and her team have a really robust monitoring program where they're sampling in real, not in real time, but they're sampling on a regular basis and trying to identify issues in the stream. Generally speaking, it's okay to go in the river. Don't go in the river. Is it 72 hours after a big storm? Usually what we tell people, 48 to 72 hours, right? That's when all this stuff washes off the land and it's gross. But beyond that, it's okay, right? Like you're not going to immediately get sick. Bacteria, PCBs is the third. Polychlorinated biphenyls. They're a legacy contaminant from the industrial era. They were banned in 1979. So they're not something that is being produced anymore. In certain cases, they can be a byproduct of other certain industrial processes, but at very, very low concentrations. The PCBs that are in the watershed, that are in the universe now, they're legacy, they're old, right? They've been around forever. They were used for temperature and corrosion resistance transformers and various other industrial processes because they're really, really strong. They're really robust chemicals. They can't ever be broken down, which now is like, oops, probably about not to have done, right? We can't get rid of it, right? So similarly, the concentrations that you find these things in the Roanoke River and its watersheds are extraordinarily low. They're higher than the state says that they ought to be, but they're still like, I'm going to say microscopic. Maybe Mckenzie can help me with some analogies, but basically they're almost unmeasurable in their concentration. You can measure them, but they're very, very low concentration. So with the portfolio of things that our team is doing, so we're working on the flooding issues and we're working on the water quality issues and the projects that we deliver and the strategies that we're working towards, ideally would check both boxes. They would work towards that flooding problem. They would work towards the water quality problem. And with that, let me say it this way. If you think about the streams only in a flooding context, they're essentially a liability, right? It's like, oh, we have these streams, right? But all they do is flood and they bother us and they make our lives miserable. If we think about it that way, they're a liability. What our team is trying to do is we're trying to it's a good word for this. We're trying to reconstitute these systems as assets, as community assets, right? That's why you guys see greenways going along the rivers. That's why you say a lot of the park systems are along the rivers. All the cities that have done really well with their waterways, so think Greenville, South Carolina, San Antonio, Texas, they realize that those waterways can be community assets and not just liabilities. They can be liabilities, of course, when it floods, but if they're only liabilities, that doesn't make any sense, right? They can bring the community significant good. And I think here in Roanoke, the city and the county and the whole valley in general has realized that, and we're moving towards that. And I think that's a really important way to frame waterways is let's capitalize on that asset, on that natural asset, right? Let's make good with them. So I'm glad that Roanoke is doing that. Obviously, my family loves to recreate in the rivers and parks and so forth. So, all right, so that's enough backdrop. Let me do really quick what our team does, and then I'll hand it over to Mckenzie for some floodplain regulation. So again, our team is Roanoke City Stormwater. There's about 50 folks on our team. We've got about 20 sort of technical science, engineering, administrative type people and about 30 people that build and do and fix and know how to do excavators and all kinds of cool stuff. So it's a pretty fun team to work with. At the middle of the team, at the hub of the team, is this idea that we're creating this clean water legacy. Okay, so what I just shared about reconstituting our streams as natural assets, the catchphrase is for those that live, work, learn, and play in the watersheds, right? So if you're invested in Roanoke, we want the streams to be kind of, of value to you, not just a problem for you. And so that's sort of like the middle of our stormwater strategic objectives. The three more on my ground level type objectives that we're working towards, one is reducing community flood risk. Note that I didn't say reduce flooding, okay? The important thing is, like, if there's flooding, but there's no damage, there's no risk to human life, leave it, right? Make the property amenable to flooding, let it soak in. As long as there's no damages, as long as there's no impacts and no issues to people, flooding is just gonna happen, right? But if we can reduce the risk to humans, that's important, right? And so just an important sort of verbiage distinction, but I think it's, for you guys important to understand that our goal is not to just reduce flooding generally, it's to reduce flood risk. Improve water quality, as I just mentioned, we have those three regulatory prerogatives that we're working towards. And then the last piece is manage assets. So I haven't talked about this quite yet, but a couple of minutes ago, I mentioned we've got 10 miles of Roanoke River in the city. We've got 53 miles of smaller waterways. Okay, so it's little streams like Murray Run and Mudley Creek. How many miles of storm drain pipe do you think the city has? Somebody just take a wild guess. This is always kind of a fun exercise. We all think 10 miles?
1,000.
1,000? Amber says 1,000. Anyone else? 500. 500. Okay. Let's do one more.
799.
799.
$1.
Let's drop $1.
It wasn't.
$1. 250 miles. 250 miles of storm drain. So you could put storm drain pipe along the highway from Roanoke down to Knoxville, Tennessee, the whole way. Okay, it's a 43 square mile city, right? It's not that big of a city. We have 250 miles of storm drain pipes. So what I'm getting at there is not just like, oh wow, that's amazing. It's like, it's all hidden. Nobody sees those pipes, right? Once they go in the ground, it's like they're there, it's invisible. But that pipe system is constantly deteriorating, right? There's always something going wrong with it. And our capital projects manager tells me astonishing numbers. It's like, I want to say like $10,000 for like an 8-foot stick of pipe or something. It's crazy, right? You guys know this. Labor costs and material costs it's astonishing. And so we have this incredible just challenge. We've got the waterways to manage and the flooding, the water quality, but we also have an enormous volume of capital assets that we're trying to keep up with. We did an estimate recently of, if we try to replace our pipe system every 100 years on a 100-year cycle, which is pretty standard for concrete, right? Concrete can last a really long time if it's concrete pipe. Our annual replacement schedule for that would be somewhere around $55 million per year to do that. The stormwater team's annual revenue is somewhere around $9 to $10 million. So we would need more than 5 times just to keep up with that piece of the program, right? Or there would need to be some sort of bonds or some other, so we go after grants, we get tons of grant money. Sometimes we can multiply our funds by 2 times. In good years, we multiply our funds by 10 times. Not every year, right? And that depends on the external funding situation, which, may not always be a good thing. So the point there is that managing assets kind of undergirds both of those strategic objectives, right? Effective management of flood risk, effective management of water quality means you've got to take care of your stuff. But there's a lot of stuff to take care of. So 250 miles of pipe, we've got like 18,000 manholes and inlets and all kinds of structures out there. I could go on, right? The numbers just get bigger. You guys see this on the news all the time. $20 billion or whatever. It's like, okay, just big number, right? So important to understand that though. And then the last 2 pieces, which I think are part of the reason why we're here, is that we realize we can't do that alone, right? We must work with our community. And so what I mean by that is, the private developers, the realtor community, the builders, the people that outside of the city government are really shaping the community. there's investment, there's money in the private sector. There's people that want to team up with us to move the ship in the direction that the community needs to go. That's really not an option for us, right? Based on that gap between what the funding that we have and the volume of work that we need to deliver, there needs to be partnerships with the private sector in order to make this happen. And so I would just encourage you all to think about in your own domains and your own spheres of influence, what could that look like, right? What could that, how could you collaborate with the city's team to close that gap? So that's the work together piece, and then the other element is the workforce development piece. As if I wasn't painting enough bad enough picture as it is. Who's going to do this? You all have worked with home builders, you've worked with contractors, right? It's hard. It's really hard. And it's a now problem. It's a now problem, but it's also a 20 years from now problem. You all are struggling with it. We're looking for, builders, we're looking to keep people, we're looking to hire people, we're looking to develop them. And it feels like we're grabbing at rice or something, right? It's so difficult to find and maintain and grow quality people to keep us moving. Like, you don't want me running the excavator. It would be horrible, right? It'd be terrifying. We need people that know how to do that well. And our economy just is not furnished with that right now. So that's another important strategic objective. Last thing that I want to just mention, and ought to have maybe mentioned this earlier. Here's a nice little photograph or an image of a house and a couple of water connections. So we interact with a lot the Western Virginia Water Authority, but that is a totally separate organization from us that is managing their infrastructure independently of us. We work together a ton, but just so you all understand, when we talk about Roanoke City stormwater, the domain that is us is the catch basin on your street, so that maybe sometimes it looks like that, or sometimes it's the curb inlet. It flows into usually a gravity pipe that's completely separate in Roanoke from the sewer system. Some cities, some older eastern seaboard cities had combined systems where the drainage and the sewage was in the same pipe. The EPA in like the 70s made this huge push to separate those systems. There's still some of them left, but there's not as many as there used to be. Roanoke had a couple of small locations where that was the case, where the sewer and the stormwater went in the same pipe. But as best as we know, between us and the water authority, that doesn't exist here. The two systems are completely independent of each other. So if you guys are working with a potential buyer or a seller and you've got a sewer issue, right, that's the Western Virginia Water Authority. If you've got a drainage or a storm drain issue, that's us. So just make sure that you separate those two things clearly in your mind. Yes, Amber.
So when we order an I&I from the Western Virginia Water Authority, they're making sure that any stormwater is not going into your sewer. When I'm looking at this, it's like, how do they figure that out?
Yeah, that's the idea. You want to make sure that you're not getting stormwater into the sewer, because if that's happening, the water authority is treating way more water than they need to. How do they figure that out? Is they have these little camera systems that they can run through the pipes that can detect broken pipes, they can detect issues with joints, that sort of thing. There's also like smoke tests that they can do. There's also dye tests that they can do. There's a couple of different methods so that they can assure that I&I is not happening. It's not a perfect science, but it is I think they have a pretty good process for it. A little bit outside of my domain, but Mckenzie, do you have anything to add to that? At a transaction, I'm trying to think. Typically, our storm drain assets are in the public right. So they're, the things that as a realtor you would be looking for would be if there is a storm drain asset that's on a private property, is there some sort of a legal arrangement for that, right? Who is responsible for O&M over the long term of that asset? Is there an easement or an assignment document that clearly defines okay, this pipe goes through this person's property, but the city's taking O&M responsibility, or no, it's the private property owner's responsibility from this point. We don't, the stormwater team isn't gonna really mess with the sewage stuff, right? That's gonna be the water authority. But there are a lot of situations in Roanoke City and probably in the county as well, where the land was not as cleanly set up as it maybe ought to have been. Or maybe there was a record at some point of who's responsible for this pipe, who owns the pipe, and it's got lost, and you just can't find it. So those are the kinds of issues that you'd want to work out with your owner, and you could call our office as well to see if we have any records of who's going to take care of this thing. So you really don't want a storm drain pipe underneath your building or through your property if it's possible. But in some cases, obviously, you have to do it. So we have ways of managing that if that's the case. All right, doing good. Let's see. Let's transition over to FEMA floodplains. So Mckenzie Brocker, our water quality administrator, is going to come up and do that piece.
Thanks, Marcus. As you mentioned, my name is Mckenzie. I'm the water quality administrator, but I'm also in charge of the CRS program, which I'll explain a little bit later. So I touched on the floodplain side as well. So I'll just explain a little bit about what the FEMA floodplains are and how to read the maps. So if you're ever looking at those, you can understand those. And how they represent flood risk. Does anyone have any experience looking at floodplain maps or trying to figure out if they're in a floodplain a little bit? Okay, so hopefully this will be helpful then. So I'll show you the map in a minute, but there's going to be mainly 3 flood zones that you want to know to look for, and it's on something called the BFE. So the main flood zone that FEMA is always talking about is AE or A. There's a slight distinction I'll explain. It's also called the 100-year floodplain, or they're transitioning into the 1% annual chance floodplain. They're trying to get away from the 100-year term because that's kind of confusing. People think, oh, it's only going to happen every 100 years, right? But really, it's every year you have about a 1% chance of that size of flood occurring, but it could happen back to back. It could happen every 5 years. It could happen whenever. We never know. It's not a matter of if it will flood that big. It's just when. And this is kind of the probability of a flood of that size happening. So this is the floodplain when we're talking about zone AE. It's also called the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. So that will be the main area you're looking at to see if you need flood insurance or regulations. Connected to that is called the BFE, or the base flood elevation, and that's just how high the water level is modeled to be during that size flood. So you'll see it abbreviated as BFE, or base flood elevation. We've also got the floodway, and that's a little bit kind of complicated because it's not something you can see based on the stream, like a modeled area of risk, but it's the highest risk zone. Where that would be the highest and quickest moving floodwaters. And so that has the most development restrictions in that zone, and that's called the floodway. And often you'll see that, I think on our digital maps, it's like a dark blue, sometimes it'll be like a slash line. So that's the highest risk. And then another area of risk, but the lowest compared to these, is what's called zone X. Or the 500-year floodplain. You might have heard, again, they're transitioning away from that to the 0.2% chance. So this is a larger flood that could still happen. And there's not really much regulation to this, but it's often mapped just so you can kind of see where you are in the risk with flooding. But some areas in the country are starting to incorporate this area into some regulations. We're not, but just so you know, this is something you could look at to see some relative risk. This is just kind of for your information about how many structures there are in these different types of zones. So just for interest, and of course, ideally, you know, we'd like to see the least amount in the floodway, which that's the lowest, and maybe the most in flood zone X, that's the lower risk. So we do have more here in our zone A's and AEs. And the distinction I'll explain between zone A and zone AE. Zone A just means that there's not a designated BFE. That's a base flood elevation that we talked about earlier. And that A lot of regulations are based on your BFE, so if you're in a zone A, we have a couple like downtown. There's a couple of small areas, so we have a few zone A's in the city. You won't have a BFE provided to you by FEMA. So you'll just need to contact the planning department and work with them on getting a BFE, but everywhere else is a zone AE, so you'll have a BFE provided to you. So that's the distinction between those zones. Any questions on the zones? It's a little bit easier when you look on the map, but that's kind of the basics of what those are designating. Okay, so a lot of great information you're going to be able to find provided to you by the city on the city real estate GIS. We have a link, but it's on the homepage as well. If you scroll down on the City of Roanoke homepage, click on City Real Estate GIS. There's a lot of great information on there in general, but you can also access the floodplain layers. So this is what it will look like when you pull it up. And then up to the top left, there's a layers option. And it will look like this. There's a lot of different layers options that are really helpful, but on the bottom there is the FEMA floodplain layers. So you click on the little arrow to the side and it will drop down and give you lots of options. So one of them at the top there is the base flood elevations, the BFE that I was talking about. And the last option is a special flood hazard area. As I mentioned, that's the another name for the flood zone. So if you check that, you know, all the blue areas, those will be all the floodplains will pop up and they'll appear, and the little plus sign, I don't know if we have a slide that shows, but the little plus sign next to it will give you a legend as well for what the different colors mean. So that's helpful as well. So here, I believe, like I said, the dark blue is the floodway, and I believe the lighter blue is the floodplain. But you can zoom in on properties and navigate around with these layers on, and then you can see, you know, how the properties are in the floodplains or not. And then again, if you check that box, it will turn on the base flood elevations. You can see here on this property, it appears at 936.6, so that may be helpful if you're trying to do some building or developing and see, oh, do I need 2 feet above that, etc. Another helpful tip, which we didn't put on the slides, I think, but if you're, so that's an elevation, you're like, okay, I don't know how tall this building is or this land, you know, what am I looking at here? Just to help you understand, there's actually the topography layers, a couple above that. You can click on that as well and turn on the contours in there. And it will have the elevations listed there, you know, every 10 feet of the contours of the parcel you're looking at. So you can at least get a general idea, you know, that won't give you the regulatory actual elevation, but it'll give you an idea of what you're looking at compared to the BFE. It's kind of helpful if you're just kind of scrolling around. And again, so these are important because there's a lot of, you know, the development and building and your insurance regulations are based off of these elevations and these risk zones established by FEMA. And this will be shown on what's called an elevation certificate. So if you're building a house or doing improvements on a house, or work has been done in the past, and you're in a floodplain, you'll get what's called an elevation certificate. And a surveyor or an engineer, an architect will go out and they'll take all these elevations. It'll be an official document to certify that it's accurate. And it'll give it to planning and they'll approve it all in their process and say, you're doing this right, you know, you're at the correct elevation, etc. But this is just showing some of the different elevations that it's looking for on that form. But it's an important piece of planning and making sure your building is safe from flooding risk. So typically, like in Roanoke, the rule is you need to be 2 feet above the BFE in the floodplain, your lowest floor, including the basement. And so you can access these elevation certificates. We have them public. They're public documents for any property. And so on this same website that we were on, the real estate GIS, if you click on a property, the parcel, this little box will come up and you can click view detail. And this box will open up, and again, there's a lot of good info in here that you can find, but there's a flooding tab there on the bottom. And that will have your certificates linked in this little category, if there are any. And those, they're highlighted blue, and so you can click on it and it will pull up, you know, a hyperlink of the actual elevation certificate itself. And so these have to be like manually updated to this website. So if you think there should be one that you're not finding on the website, you can always call Stormwater, and because it's updated quarterly. So maybe the elevation certificate is not up yet. You can call the Stormwater offices and we'll be able to pull it And make sure it's accurate or get you the most recent one if you think, for some reason, there might be one that's not linked yet. So that's a little info about that. But they're all linked there for you. And if you have any issues with it, you can call the stormwater department as well. So that's kind of just about how to navigate the map, and how to see the flood zones. Just in general, to give a little bit background in the insurance piece, a lot of that happens outside of the stormwater piece, but for your awareness, if you have a home and a mortgage and you're in the floodplain, it is required to have flood insurance. And there is a 30-day waiting period. So we always remind people, don't wait to get flood insurance until you hear the forecast. Oh, there's a storm coming up the coast. Maybe it's a good time to call your insurance agent. You want to call, it's dry weather while you're, it's a happy time, and get on the list and get in there. But a lot of times that happens at the point of sale. Transitioning if you're in the floodplain, because they're aware of that requirement with your mortgage agency, but just a heads up. And then I mentioned the CRS program, so I'm in charge of that, and that is a FEMA program where they try to give discounts to people, because flood insurance is very expensive, and they're aware of that, so they give discounts to in coordination with the local government based on the floodplain management strategies and benefits that we try to employ in the city. And if we're doing a good job by FEMA standards, they'll give, everyone in our community a discount based off of that. So we're working hard on that side to try to get people discounts. We recently moved to a class 6, which is a little bit better this last year. So that's 20% people are getting on their premiums since we're a class 6 community. And if you have questions about the CRS program and things like that, you can call our office as well. But we're kind of doing that in the background, and it automatically applies to the citizens who are in the floodplain.
That's strictly for like residential.
Commercial as well. Yeah, anyone in the floodplain.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was just wondering if you knew if that discount was better than like private flood insurance, like does it equate to something like that, or how significant does that really make a difference?
I'm not sure, because we don't see the insurance numbers that are going out to
Right.
the specific people, but it applies on any premium that they're getting for federally backed insurance. So
Okay,
I guess they could themselves go to a private one and compare it to someone who's FEMA backed and see if it's a better deal or not. But yeah, it's hard for me to tell
No,
on
that's okay.
our side. But yeah, hopefully it's helping a lot, I think probably here in Roanoke, I think a lot of places like Florida and stuff have a lot more private insurers as the insurance is changing. But I think here there's probably not that many that aren't FEMA backed and would get this discount automatically anyway, but I'm not sure. I think that's my part. I think you're gonna follow up with
Yeah.
some other resources, but yeah.
Whenever we talk about floodplains, we always get a lot of questions about, insurance premiums and rates and stuff, and that really is for our team a black box. Like, we really don't, the insurance companies are not disclosing that kind of information to us, which is good. But it's a big question, right? It's like, okay, I'm looking at this property, I'm trying to gauge risk, and trying to gauge my investment numbers and that sort of thing. How much is this gonna cost? And it's like, we don't know how the insurance folks are actually made. It's some function of, obviously, if you're in the zone AE, that puts you into the gotta get flood insurance bucket, but then beyond that, it's hard to guess at that. So okay, so last couple slides. Outside of, as I mentioned earlier, outside of the river flooding that happens in Roanoke, there's a lot of flood risk that's just out there. Okay, and if you're trying to figure out where, I'm looking at this house, I'm trying to learn as much as I can about it. You guys have tons of tools, I'm sure, right? Like, there's all kinds of things that your organization is going to provide you. This is one tool in the flood domain that is going to give you an extra piece of information about flood risk. It's not a regulatory thing, okay? The FEMA maps are the regulatory product that if you're in that, you got to go down the FEMA pathway and insurance pathway. What I'm going to show you here is for information purposes only, right? So a couple of years ago, this organization called First Street Foundation built a continental flood model. So they have this everywhere here in the US. And it's not just for rivers, it's for all kinds of small drainage ways. And it's based on some pretty good science. The physics and engineering behind it are pretty strong, as best I can tell. It's not perfect, it's not perfect, it's just a model, right? So it's not gonna give you like perfect information about flooding, but it is helpful. On my screen, I have shown just like a random house in Roanoke and the FEMA flood maps, all right? So you can see that FEMA is saying this house is, it's outside of all those flood zones, all those FEMA flood zones, okay? This First Street Foundation product, if you bring it up, it shows that there is indeed some flood risk through there, and if you look at that property, it's a drainage low point, right? So there's a pretty big storm drain system that goes through there. Water's gonna collect there from upslope. There's a non-zero flood risk at that property. Okay. Again, no regulations go with that. It's just something that as you're working with your buyers and sellers, it's something that you may want to leverage. There's a really nice NAR white paper on this product that kind of gives some guidance to realtors on how to use this thing, what it means, what it doesn't mean. That's out of scope for me. The modeling is strong, so that's my domain. Is like I looked at this and read the technical papers behind it and thought they did a good job. It's not hokey pokey like wizardry, right? They didn't just make it up. The people that developed this model are smart people that are hydraulic people that know how to make this stuff happen. So if you're concerned about that, I can give you some assurance in that way, but beyond that, how you apply it is, it's your own discretion. It's NAR's got some good guidance on that. The maps for the Roanoke River recently changed, so that red outline there shows in 2023, the city just updated the floodplain maps. That was part of finishing the big flood reduction project that was started back in like the 1970s, and they finally finished building it in 2012. All the big excavation areas along the river that they put in, we had to update the flood maps to reflect the new physical condition on the ground. So we finished those maps in 2023 along the river. Subsequently, FEMA is updating the floodplain maps for all the smaller tributaries now. So they're actually working with a contractor. They're telling us that those preliminary maps are going to be available in fall of this year. So that that means you would have effective or final maps maybe January of 2026. And that map change means that there may be homes and commercial sites that are not currently in the floodplain that may be in the floodplain in 2026, and maybe the other way around, right? So that's an important shift. Also, the base flood elevation that Mckenzie mentioned, when the models change, a lot of times those elevations change as well. And so that can have a bearing on, redevelopment potential of a given site. If the BFE goes down from what it was before, all of a sudden you may have a site that is more saleable for redevelopment, or maybe the other way around, right? If that BFE goes way up, then all of a sudden the site that you were thinking you could put a building in there or something, it's like it would be impossible based on the new flood. So something for you all to be aware of. If you're interested in keeping up with that, just please reach out. We can. Amber, do you have a question on that?
So if you had a property that was not in the floodplain and now the new map puts it in the floodplain and all of a sudden you can't build on it, it's not buildable. Will the city condemn it, buy from it?
There would not be a condemnation process. I'll answer the second question in just a minute, though. That's a really good question.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, of
So
course.
in that situation, would the people that are living there, would they be grandfathered in? Or would they have to go to their insurance company?
Okay, so I'm a homeowner of an existing site.
Right.
When I bought the house, I followed the rules. I was not in the floodplain. I don't have flood insurance. All of a sudden FEMA goes and changes the maps. I'm in the zone AE. What do I do?
Right.
So typically what happens in that case is the answer is actually no. Usually you would have to go get flood insurance. If you're trying to redevelop the site, that's a little bit more complicated.
Sure.
But if you're just saying like, okay, I've already got the property, I'm living in it, all of a sudden maps change. Assuming you have a federally backed open mortgage, right? So that's the trigger. If you don't have that federally backed open mortgage, then there is not a statutory requirement for you to have flood insurance. Is that right? Yeah. So in that case, nothing will change, right? I don't have flood insurance now. You could choose to go get it if you wanted to, but it wouldn't be a requirement of the flood insurance program. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yes.
I guess what triggers that change? Like, is it your mortgage that notifies you, oh, by the way, now you have to have this, or does the city say you're now in a floodplain? Who notifies the homeowner?
Really good question. Let's see. So in this instance, FEMA initiated the study. The maps are really old. They're like a 2007. And FEMA's on this rolling cycle of trying to update the maps and make them more realistic. So here we are, they're updating maps. FEMA issues they put a notification in the newspaper, which is unreadable and nobody's gonna, it's not gonna be helpful, right? In some cases, like, I guess you could figure it out that way. It's pretty unlikely. I actually don't know if the mortgage companies track these things like in real time. I think there's probably some way that it's gonna get caught eventually.
It probably would be through the mortgage company because the requirement is to the financial side. Not through.
In the analytics that would have been done back in 23, did the city correlate with that and put together a list of homes?
We did, yeah, because that's a good question. In that case, the city led that study. We had a federal requirement from FEMA to change the maps. And so for that study, we actually hired the engineer to go remap them. And in that case, because we led that study, we sent a letter to the people that were impacted by it in the mail that said, this is what happened, okay? I don't think we told them because it was like, there was like hundreds of buildings, right? It was like, there was no way we could say exactly what happened to the property. But we sent him a letter that was like, this is what happened. There's a pretty good chance that your floodplain maps changed. The status may be no different, right? But if you have any questions about it, you can call our office and we'll answer all the questions that we can until the point that it's like, we're talking about flood insurance. We can't answer those questions, right? In that case, that happened because the city led that study. When FEMA leads the study, we don't know, right? They're just doing their thing. So there isn't necessarily a notification process that's as precise as what we do. That's a good question. So this question over here, did I finish that one? I kind of jumped around.
No, you did.
Okay.
The answer is, we don't really know.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the back end of it, the financial end of it is as opaque to us as like to the
Right.
community. It would be wonderful if that was more transparent, but that's all private interaction. The city doesn't really need to be involved in that.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah, but
So-
the requirement for insurance is on the financial side, so probably would come around through your mortgage base at some point.
I was gonna second part mine with the 30-day timeline that you gave for I couldn't remember if it was for the discount or for the active flood insurance.
For flood insurance, yeah, the discount was automatically applied
Okay.
as we're class 6, they should have any.
So then when this goes into, if this were going, I know we're chasing a lot of bad case scenarios here. I think,
Sure.
But if that were to go into effect, then does that 30-day, did you get a grandfather in on that? You're automatically,
So that's a good question. So there is a waiver for that. If you're buying a house, there's not a 30-day waiting period for flood insurance. And there may be also a way if there's like a flood study like this, since FEMA's doing it, because the waiting period is implemented by FEMA itself. I'm not exactly sure in coordination with the flood study, but if it's at a point of sale, it's waived anyway for the 30-day waiting period.
Yeah, so the scenario you just described is like FEMA comes and changes the maps. And then they're like, you gotta wait 30 days, and then it floods, and you're like, well, you may wait 30 days, right? Yeah. Yeah, kind of, yeah. Good, really good questions. Others? This is really good, appreciate this.
Yeah, so
Sure.
this floodplain, this provision that they're going, is this just for Roanoke State, or does it cover all of like
Great question.
the upper Roanoke River?
Yeah.
Portion?
This, what you're seeing here in red, so let me. If you want to zoom, so the question was, do the new flood studies cover just Roanoke City, or is it more expansive to the Roanoke County or whatever? So the study that we finished in 2023 only focused on the river in the city. So what the red outline that you're seeing there, that was the extent of that study. The study that's underway presently with FEMA. Should I try to do this? I'm gonna try to do this. It's dangerous. The study that FEMA's doing, it covers all of these waterways.
Okay.
All right, so and I think they actually are going a little bit further downstream in this too. So I think they're also doing Bat Creek, which is the one that's right here. Close to here. And so FEMA study is not just Roanoke City, it's Roanoke County, Montgomery County, all the, how does interact with that. It's a good question. All right. Let's try to close this out. We're 10 after 12.
We have one question.
Yep.
Hey, Marcus, I have one question from our Zoom attendees. Is there any plan to dredge or clean the Roanoke River, such as near the Riverland planned development around Bennington Road and Southeast?
Not to my knowledge. We do have an ongoing debris removal program that's focused really on the bridge structures. So the 13th Street Bridge and the 9th Street Bridge tend to be pretty big debris hangers. And usually after a big event, our city engineer's office will get a contractor out there to clear all that out. We're also doing that basically at, I would not say all waterways around the city, but that is part of the CRS program, is keeping those waterways open to flood passage. So if there's a big debris jam along a structure, a culvert or something like that, we're clearing them. Dredging is typically like the permitting agencies, like the Corps of Engineers and Fish and Wildlife Service would not really allow us to do that anymore. So the shape of the river is essentially what it will be moving forward. But in terms of like debris management, there is a pretty good program for that. So Laura, hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, last two things. So going back to the question that Amber asked. There are situations here in Roanoke where maybe there was a map change, or maybe there's just a flood risk, I can't get out of this property type situation, that the city is able to purchase these properties. Okay, so we call it the high flood risk buyout program. Most of these situations, like, so for example, we have one that's like it's an older woman, she's ready to move on into an assisted living facility. The house is a flood risk house. Sometimes you can't get it you can't get it sold on the market. If the flood risk is just too high, it's been damaged. We have the ability through a FEMA program, funding through a FEMA program to purchase these homes. The city can do this. So the fate of these homes can be, nationally, you'll see sometimes that they get elevated, right? FEMA actually provides for that. That's actually not something that we've really engaged in here in Roanoke, because that only works in like certain situations. Most of what we've done is we've acquired the structure and demolished it outright. We've just turned the site over to, essentially, we've just let it flood. A greenway or a park asset could go there in the future, but really no other structures that can go there moving forward. The images that I have shown here, so the site over here on the right-hand side, maybe you all saw the demolition of the former Ramada Hotel and Conference Center there on Franklin Road. We did that, our team did that out of a FEMA grant. And then there's one over here on the bottom left, that was I guess it was like it's an old retirement center or something, right? And it was flooding all the time. That one's a little bit more hidden, it's off of 10th Street Northwest. Similar problem, just flooded all the time, and had been on the market forever. Really wasn't saleable. The city approached the owner and said, hey, we've got this program, would you be interested in it? They said, it's great. If you go look at the site now, it's wonderful. It's like wildflowers growing everywhere, and it's right by Greenway. And the Ramada property, the former Ramada property is, the trajectory is similar, right? It's reopen the stream, floodplain plantings, those sorts of things. So we can, with this program, we can really do what I've described earlier, which is you take the stream from being just purely a liability. In that case, to the hotel, it was like once per year, we had our swiftwater rescue people pulling people out of that place. You convert it into this really nice place for people to enjoy. The buyout program really enables us to do that. So if you guys have, people that you think may be interested in that, just keep that in mind, right? It's just a resource that you can leverage in your domain. So I have a couple of parameters on the screen. It's 100% voluntary. There's no, there's no condemnation. It's just you come to us, if it works for the city, if it works for you, we can do it. If you want to pull out anytime, totally fine. Right? Not a problem. Usually it's appraised value or assessed value or higher is what we buy the properties at. So you're not, you're not gonna make a killing doing it. It's just sort of like a market purchase. And we look for contiguous properties. If there's like 5 homes that are flooding all the time that are, we just, it's not gonna work for them to sell it. And everybody wants to leave. That's a good purchase. So, okay. Tons of other relevant information, links. We'll share the PowerPoint with you guys after the fact, so you all can click on them. Any other questions? That's the last slide that we have. It's, a couple minutes after noon. Yeah. Thanks for the chance to come talk, and we'll stick around. Yes, sir.
How would we find out about the floodplain buyout you just went over? Who would we call?
You can come talk to me afterwards and we can chat, or you can call our main line that is there, 853-5900. So you can call the office and they'll direct you to somebody that can answer questions about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have some documents here if you want to grab while you're here for the in-person people. This is a report on like water quality stuff, and just we put this out every year about what stormwater is doing, called the state of our waters. And then I have one of the flooding in Roanoke brochures. We send this out to everyone in the special flood hazard area, the floodplain. But it has a bunch of flooding and information on how to access the maps. And then Marcus mentioned back in the early part of the presentation, if anyone was here in the flood of 1985, we're doing a project, so if you're interested and want to share your story, have a little flyer, you could take that, or a couple of fun takeaways if you want them.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Really great information.